Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first formal session of the Customer and Support Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee's inquiry into working with and developing local supply chains. My name's Martin Eddy. I'm the Cornwall Councillor for the St Cleer Division, and today I'm going to be joined by four of my fellow councillors as part of the inquiry panel. I'll ask them to introduce themselves a little bit later on. This inquiry seeks over a number of sessions to look at how Cornwall Council sources its suppliers and looks at any issues they have in supplying the council through their eyes. We want to understand how social value is currently introduced into and measured in our contracts, and to explore what other local authorities do to enhance social value and address climate change in their procurement process. We hope our work will produce recommendations to Council around our operating models, key performance indicators and possible changes to the contract procedure rules. Today's session is being recorded but not transmitted live. The recordings will be available to the public to view online. Robert Buckley, our Technical Support Officer, is on paternity leave, having become a father again this week, and we wish him and the family well. And we thank Sarah Wilson in Commercial Services for stepping in to support us. This session must be framed in the current COVID-19 pandemic, which is pulling staff away from their normal work, both here and other local authorities. And this is a period of change as we shift to an outcome-based budget, delivering a target operating model for procurement, a complete overhaul of the contract procedure rules. This inquiry is being run so that it integrates with Councillor Kirkin and Desmond's motion to full council around Cornwall Council procurement principles and the Cornwall suppliers. We appreciate all the work of our officers and members in getting us to the start line today, and I must especially mention our committee clerk Tracy for her invaluable help and boundless enthusiasm. So we've already had one informal session on the 23rd of September, and thank you to Tracy Langley, Rachel Rotheroe, Sharon Hamilton and Sarah Wilson for their frank view of the world of procurement. Today we have 5 witnesses, Councillor Mike Eathorne-Gibbons, Nick Hayden, Kath Robinson, Mark Pearce and Rachel Rotheroe. On Thursday the 5th, inquiry members will be attending a virtual social value conference, and on Thursday the 12th of November we have external witnesses from the Voluntary Sector Forum, from the Cornwall Chamber of Commerce, from the South West Procurement Board, Nick McElroy, the Chief Executive for the Centre for Local Strategic Economies, and Anne van der Meulen from the Federation of Small Businesses will be providing us with a written statement. Thursday the 26th of November we'll be talking to other authorities. We so far lined up Bristol and North East Somerset, Wiltshire, Plymouth City Council, and we're currently in discussion with Manchester City Council and Preston City Council. Bristol City Council will be supplying evidence in writing. In addition, we have a survey out with local authorities and 3 replies to date. Hopefully our final session, Wednesday the 9th of December, when we will ask officers for points of clarification on our conclusions, but pull our final thoughts together with that recommendation then going forward to the committee and then on to full council. So, to business. Today we've got 5 witnesses, and in our lines of questioning, members, we may stray into areas of sensitive commercial, it contains sensitive commercial information. In that case, I will ask the witness to supply a written answer to us outside the meeting if that's the case. Our timings today have been circulated, and I'll do my best to keep you and the witnesses to them. If we run over time, I may ask that remaining questions are answered in writing, and members may wish, if they want to ask a supplementary question. We've allowed time at the end of the session for observers to have some input, and we will conclude with some reflections on today's sessions. So what I'd like to do is the inquiry members that are present, perhaps they could say hello. So Councillor Mould.
Yep. Hi, good morning, Carol Mould. I'm Cornwall Councillor for St Minver and St Endelion.
Good morning, Councillor Moorcroft.
Good morning, everyone. Robin Moorcroft, Cornwall Councillor for Weybridge West.
I'm, as I've said earlier, Councillor Martin Eddy, representing the St Cleer division. We are waiting for Councillor Keeling to join us, who has some technical difficulties, along with Councillor Lee Frost from Bodmin. So we will press on with this session
Chairman,
in their absence.
Apologies for interrupting. We've had apologies from Councillor Frost now that he won't be able to attend today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting us know. Good morning. Good morning, Councillor Mike Eathorne-Gibbons. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman and colleagues. Nice to be able to join you today from almost sunny Truro, but not quite. Thank you for allowing me to say a few words. Perhaps I ought to formally introduce myself first. I'm the Cabinet Member for Customers, and I represent Lellet, St Clement and St Erme. I've been given a brief to cover three areas today. First of all, my views on the topic, then my views in terms of our contractors' understanding of social value, and thirdly, how all this can help customer experience. First of all, can I say I welcome this review. It has wide terms of reference, which I think is entirely appropriate given the importance of contracts to the council. As you know, the council spends something like 750 million a year, which is a big number. We have a significant number of contractors, both large and small. So I think it's appropriate and timely there is this view. In terms of your terms of reference, there really are three key priorities for me. One is the difficulties in sourcing suppliers. Secondly, the barriers for local suppliers, and you'll probably be hearing more of this from the FSB, but certainly in my experience, a number of them do find the processes somewhat bureaucratic. And I do have concerns, certainly when I was a member of the FSB, a number of colleagues used to say they are bureaucratic and frankly, too much hassle, not worth applying. So you want to pursue this a little bit more, I would suggest. And the third key area for me is the appropriateness of the target operating model and the KPIs that we are putting forward as part of the tender assessment and measures of progress to meet targets. Those are important, and I'd certainly welcome, Chairman, you and your committee's views on that area. So, firstly, my views on the topic itself. As you know, a new operating model was introduced last year, bringing procurement and contract management into the same team. It is quite right that we bring social value into consideration and give it appropriate weighting. But we must ensure that this is balanced with making procurement arrangements balanced and not overly bureaucratic. We still want to put customers first and ensure they get the best possible service at the lowest possible cost. Just referring by way of introduction to the motion from Councillor Kirkham, I can certainly support the proposal in the motion because we have discussed this with her in terms of there being a positive weighting, using an e-tendering platform, continue to have a range of financial measures to ensure soundness and efficiency, ensure that the contracts do ensure significant spend is done in Cornwall, which I think is most important for the economy, and ensure arrangements to evaluate social value and climate impact are clear. So moving on to the second area, but before I do so, I would highlight some elements in terms of my first point, and that's bearing in mind the Council's appropriate and responsible approach to procurement, and it must include a number of key elements. First of all, sustainability and carbon management, equality and diversity, safeguarding, ethical sourcing, supply chain diversification, health and safety, and of course, social value. Number of elements there that inevitably do make the procurement more complex than they might be in the private sector, but I think it's right that as a local authority, we do take a responsible approach to this whole issue. So As regards the second element of the brief I've been given, our contractor's understanding of social value. To be quite honest, I'm not sure I know the answer to this, but I suspect it will vary considerably both within and between small and large suppliers, and the weight given to it will probably vary too. And indeed, it may or may not differ otherwise good suppliers applying. So that's the best I can do on that second challenging question.
Do you think, so thank you. Thank you for that. So that perhaps there isn't, you don't know really if there is sufficient understanding of social value amongst contractors. So we should dig around there a little bit further. Is that?
Certainly, I think that would be very useful, Chairman. Certainly my experience of small business, as I said earlier, a number of them are not comfortable with the processes as they stand. And there may be a perception, rightly or wrongly, that sometimes it's a bit bureaucratic. But certainly asking them what they feel is meant by social value, I'm not entirely sure. I know myself, I know it's to do with well-being, but I think we do need to be a little bit clear in what we mean by this. And so I think that's an area you and your colleagues may want to pursue as you go forward. The third area I've been asked to comment on is how all this can help customer experience. Well, as I said by way of introduction, for me, putting the customer first is absolutely essential. But I'm not entirely sure the customer cares about the mechanics of this, because I'm sure each and every person out there is concerned about getting a good, timely service and not having to pay too much, whether it's council tax or business rates. So probably that's all I want to say by way of introducing this matter. I really do want to say very little at this stage, as I do wish to hear from other parties, because at the end of the day, as it falls within my portfolio, I do want to be in an independent way, able to judge the appropriateness of the way forward and the working parties review and recommendations. So I think that's all I want to say by way of introduction, Chairman, but as ever, happy to take questions and points of clarification from yourself and your colleagues.
Councillors, do you have any further questions for Mike?
Yes, can I just ask Mike Martin, please? So this is not necessarily a question, it might just well be an observation. So if we're going to be really robust in the way that we meet our targets and we pay homage to, equality and procurement and all of that, and then we sort of think that maybe the customer looking for value may not pay that much attention to it. How do we marry up those 2 points, do you think?
I think that's a very interesting challenge for all of us, actually. I go back to my private experience. You take examples of the Marks and Spencers. A customer will go in there and will buy good-looking stuff at the right price. That's all they're interested in, is what they see. And I think many of our customers, that's all they see. They want good service. They don't want to have to pay too much for it, which is council tax or business rates. But I think we as an authority do have a responsibility to look at the wider thing, which is the social interactions. And so social value is an important part of that. But as I say, we've got to be a little bit careful not to make it too bureaucratic. Clearly, there's got to be a percentage allowed for social value. How much it is, I think, is a matter of debate. So that's why I welcome you and your committee looking at this in a bit of detail. Hopefully that addresses the issue raised, Carol.
Lovely, thank you.
Mike, is it something? I mean, we have a few basic metrics around it, but nothing substantial. Is it something that you would welcome as a key performance indicator, the social value within of the procurement exercises that we're undertaking, without it being too bureaucratic, but just somehow that we could see that social value? We're working towards carbon neutrality as well. And some way of measuring the social value and that within and the progress we're making in those social values.
Yes, as I indicated earlier, I think it's important as a local authority, because we are a local authority. We're not a private organisation, so I think it's right that we take a wider perspective on this. And I think we need to be as clear as we can of what we mean by social value. And then clearly, having done that, we need to have some metrics in terms of, well, first of all, the weight we need to give it in the procurement process. And I know you can talk about 5, 10, 15%, but a percentage which is fair and reasonable given the other metrics. And then we need to be specific in terms of what we mean by it. So I entirely agree with that sort of approach. And I think you and your committee probably will need to dig a little bit more in this area. It is a tricky one in my view. So good luck to you and your colleagues.
As by way of a supplementary, do you think all our contracts should have a social value element in them?
Yes, because at the end of the day, we want responsible suppliers to us. And you know, the same way, if I was at Marks and Spencer's asking for people to provide goods from India, I would not expect there to be any sort of sweatshop type situation. We do have a responsibility to the people who provide the services at the end of the day. And I don't mean to be critical of Marks and Spencer's, far from it. I should declare an interest. My wife is a shareholder, so she regularly goes to the place to keep the share price up, I'm sure. But to be serious for a moment, I think we do, as a local authority, do have a responsibility to look at this wider social issue. And I think we do need to be fairly clear in, first of all, defining the weight we want to give to it in our contract arrangements, and fairly clear in terms of how we measure and assess it. And frankly, it is not easy in my view. And I very much value this sort of professional advice from our officers, and I'll be interested to hear your conclusions as a result of that, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Robin, anything you wish to ask or add?
No, I think Mike's explained everything there very well. I was just Googling about social value, and yeah, I think it is something that we probably need to look at and in much more detail.
Yeah, my limited understanding of it is, you know, long-term well-being of people and communities. Again, that's a rather general thing. What do we mean? Yeah, it's an important issue. Trying to define what it is, what weight that needs to be given to it, and how you measure it are, I think, significant issues for you and your committee to look at, Chairman. I'm sure the officers will be able to provide some guidance as you go through. And again, I look forward to hearing other participants' views from their different perspectives. So I will be staying on board for the rest of the morning to listen to the discussions.
We are going to be talking to Kath Robinson later on. Is it something you'd want to see Cormac raise in their as part of their agenda?
I would like to hear what she's got to say first, but in principle, yes, because I think it is important.
Okay, thank you.
Because again, they're part of local government. They're owned by local government. They're not a wholly independent commercial enterprise, or they do follow the principles of that. But again, they need to take a balanced view to this, and I should be interested to hear what she's got to say.
Okay. Well, if you're content, members, I'll say thank you to Mike for your time this morning. Glad to hear you're going to stay with us. Tracy, any luck in getting a life belt to John Keeling?
No, he's not joined as yet. So I'll try and contact him while you're interviewing the next person. I've tried to bring your next witness forward, who is Nick Hayden, Programme Manager for Carbon Neutral Action Plan, and he can be free at 10:30. So you've got a gap of about 7 minutes.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to have a short break for 5 minutes. Or...
Well, we could break for 5 minutes, yes. It will give me a chance to fill my coffee cup.
Okay, and I'll try and get Councillor Keeling on.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, I was too brief, Chairman, in my comments. I didn't waffle on as long as anticipated. So there I'm sure that's good news for some, particularly if you want a cup of coffee, Chairman. I'm sure that's going to be the right approach.
Just a reminder that the recording will continue. So if you switch off your cameras and microphones for the minute while you break.
Okay.
Good morning, Nick.
Hello. Hi there.
Morning.
Okay.
Hello again. We'll check to see if when Robin and Carol are back online, we're one officer down with child duties and one down with technical duties. So we're a happy band of 3. We've got some questions that hopefully you will have had sight of to ask you. We aim to be finished around 11 o'clock. Roughly, that's just as a guideline figure. Tracy, any sign of Councillor Keeling?
No, I've left him a message, but I'm yet to hear back.
Are we allowed substitutes at this late minute, just out of interest?
No, because it has to be people who are on the working group.
Okay. In that case, Carol, would you be Lee Frost as well?
Yes, with pleasure.
And Robin, can you be John Keeling as well?
I will try, Martin, yes.
Thank you. We might have to heavily edit this later on. Are you happy if we make a start then, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Nick, my first question really is how do you see the carbon decision wheel linking with any new approach to social value? Is there a link there?
Yeah, so I think yes, I think there is. And we have been working with the Commercial Services Department to start looking at those linkages. I think the first thing to say on the decision wheel is the I guess the common misconception that we're seeing across the organisation is around that it just being seen as a climate decision wheel. And I think good reasons for that, because it was introduced off the back of the climate action plan that was presented to Cabinet July last year. But in fact, it is the decision wheel is far beyond just climate change. Its intention is to be a tool that helps the council understand the impact of decisions it's making across both social and environmental and for that matter economic areas. So it's born out of the donut economics model that Katie Rayworth introduced to Oxfam many years ago. And what sat behind it is the premise of the UN sustainability goals, and essentially the philosophy behind that is that there is a minimum resources that humanity needs to operate in, and there's a maximum resources available, and sat in the middle of that is a safe and just society for all. So that is essentially at the heart of the decision wheel. And so when you look at that in terms of social value policy and helping inform procurement decisions, we've been doing some assessment work against the national themes and outcomes measures framework to look at the alignment between the areas within the decision wheel and what the national TOMs provide. And there is, albeit early assessment and needs further validation, but there is a clear alignment between the two. That there's quite a good match. They cover the same areas, and the measures that are provided are in the main included within the decision wheel. So I think there is a strong link and a strong match.
Does that mean that it could provide us then with a sort of visual representation for social value within a contract, or certainly a decision making process?
But both. So that's and it so without that, that's the work that we're currently undertaking with Sarah in the commercial services team and her team is to look at that and look at its applicability. But from early assessment is absolutely, it could be used as a tool for assessing existing contracts, and also be used as providing an assessment into tender proposals for new contracts, and we've all seen the benefits of having that kind of visual representation to help decision makers make informed decisions. But obviously sat behind that is the real detail. I think the work we're starting to explore with commercial services is in understanding it's probably not a straight shift and lift from the decision wheel that we've currently got in place for cabinet decisions. There might be a kind of an adaptation with a further set of questions we want to ask for tender proposals. But we're very much at the early stage of that development at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. That's very interesting. So Carol.
Yeah, hi. My question was around, you sort of touched on it, the talking with commercial services team and climate change, but I'm wondering whether by tying all this together that we actually make the whole process a bit bureaucratic. I mean, how do we work towards trying to make this as effective and simple as we can?
Yeah, so procurement process, that's a difficult one for me to comment on, to be honest. So I'm coming at it from a perspective of how do we drive carbon reduction out of our supply chain, and we've made a commitment to become a carbon neutral local authority by 2030. And I think to do so, you've got to look at where your emissions sit. So without getting too technical, you've got the direct emissions that the council are responsible for in its operations that we can directly account for, and we've started to understand those quite clearly now. We have an inventory of those emissions, and then there's the indirect ones, which are through the goods and services that we provide and the supply chain, all the emissions that they account for, and they will be huge. And quite frankly, we don't know the full scale of those at present, because we don't have the systems and processes to be able to measure that. But in order to kind of become carbon neutral, there are set industry standards that we've got to meet. So there are two accreditations. There's one accreditation that's very relevant to this debate, which is the Carbon Trust Standard, and that's the accreditation that we set to guide us for development, that went into the action plan, and set the objectives for the supply chain. And what they look for, they recognise that supply chain emissions is an incredibly challenging task. But what they look for in terms of becoming an accredited, as part of the carbon supply chain accreditation, is they look for, do you have the systems in place to measure and monitor the emissions being generated through the supply chain? So that's a clear objective for us, that we have those processes in place. The second is the 3 M's. The second is the systems and processes in place to manage. So in managing, are we managing existing contracts, and have we got policies and processes in place to make good decisions about good procurement decisions? And then thirdly, the 3rd M is minimise, and that's all about action plans with our supply chain partners to reduce our footprint that exists. So it's very much about having systems and processes in place. So to what degree does that lead us down a more bureaucratic and kind of governance route? that's going to be the challenge. But at the moment, we're operating in an arena that we're not clear on the emissions that sit within our supply chain, and that's fundamentally step one.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, that actually does make sense. Thank you. It is difficult, isn't it? Because the end game is we're trying to achieve something where we get the best social value out of everything. But of course, climate change, and there's a cost attached to all of this as well. So while we're mindful in one hand, we're trying to get the best social value and to make the procurement system as easy as we can, so that we don't. My worry is that through all of this, we make it to the point where we disenfranchise people because they look at it and it is just too big a job in their eyes, especially for the smaller suppliers that say, do you know what, I can't sit here and do this because they've got to measure that up for what is the end game for them. So if I'm making sense, I just think, I think people sometimes look at these things and think, my gosh, it's a mammoth task, when I would be looking for something that was reasonably simplistic. But of course it's difficult because we have got to put all these things in place. So, I would just be wanting it to be as unbureaucratic as we can make it. But I do take your point that, we are in lots of ways in uncharted territories, aren't we?
And the direction of travel is that government. So there are a number of already legal obligations for organisations to provide carbon accounts for their organisation. Now that doesn't mean that's the carbon equivalence for providing that product or service to another organisation. But this is going to become, I envisage, more and more common for organisations to have to account for the carbon they're producing. So I completely get what you're saying for some of the smaller enterprises that we deal with now and that we want to deal with in the future. We're going to have to find ways in which we can make it easy for people. But I guess the expectation is likely to grow, both from a government perspective anyway. Yeah.
Okay, lovely. Thank you.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Nick. I can see John Keeling waving a hand at me. John, can you hear us?
Good morning, Martin. I've only just been able to join you. I've had connection problems all morning working with IS, and I've just got in. You wouldn't believe how many times I've tried. But I'm with you now, but I haven't picked up the thread. I'm not sure where you are.
Okay. Well, welcome, John. Up to now, Robin Moorcroft has been you and did a very reasonable impression, I have to say.
Did he? What, including my accent?
So we're now speaking with Nick Hayden. We've just started the session with the first two questions. I'm going to move on to the third question and ask Robin to ask that one in a minute. But okay, we've got apologies from Lee today, so we're delighted you've bolstered us. We're now up to 4. So thanks, John.
So who's the victim at the moment? Sorry, if I may.
Lee Frost can't join us today, and we're speaking to Nick Hayden.
Nick Hayden. Okay, got you. Thank you.
Okay, welcome. So, Robin, do you want to press on?
Yeah, good morning, Nick. Do you have any ideas or thoughts or suggestions on how we will be able to measure climate impact as part of the tender assessment process?
Well, I'm having spent some time now looking at the national themes and outcomes and measures framework. There's a really comprehensive list of measures that are in place as part of that, and it's a really useful tool. I think the first thing to say is obviously I'm coming at it purely from a climate change and carbon neutral lens. So our range of measures are are narrower than perhaps the wider social value policy, and which would take in a wider set of environmental measures and social and economic ones. So there's really good, and I think from just looking at the National TOMS framework from memory, there were 22 measures in there purely around GHG reduction. So we've got, I think it's worth noting that for the carbon neutral Cornwall programme, we've got six outcome areas that we're looking to address. Three of which are around carbon reduction. So the biggest measure, the biggest currency that we use for that is CO2 equivalent out. So we are running on an annual basis now a carbon inventory both at a Cornwall and a council level. So that the main currency for that is CO2 equivalent. The other areas of the other outcome areas for us is expanding our generation of renewable energy. So we want to go beyond 100% renewable energy by 2030. So that is a key measure for us as well in terms of the amount of clean energy we are creating in Cornwall. The other areas is obviously a regeneration of our natural environment. So our natural environment is a really important carbon sink for us. So we know that effectively we're not going to get to a gross zero carbon position. There's things that we do will still be creating carbon, so it's going to be important that we have natural environment in place to be able to absorb what we're still creating. So we have measures in place in terms of the amount of land that we're using to draw down and regenerate land to draw down that remaining carbon. And then the final outcome area for us is creating a resilient community. So is building resilience into Cornwall to be able to adapt to an already changing climate. So the National TOMS framework provides a really comprehensive set of measures that we're indeed starting to look at for the wider programme and looking to adopt.
Lovely, thank you, Nick.
Lovely, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Robin. Carol, do you want to step in there?
Again, yeah, this was about how we set climate impact targets against the contract management going forward. How are we able to measure the climate impact?
So yes, we are. The mechanisms by which we do that. So as I said, the best. So we now on an annual basis are running carbon account inventories both at a Cornwall level and at a council level. So we can see how we're reducing our carbon footprint now on an annual basis. So the interventions that we're putting in place, how they will reduce that. What the big dynamic here is understanding how much of that is contribute, where those supply chain emissions sit, because they currently don't sit in our council inventory, but they'll sit somewhere in our Cornwall inventory. But without being able to determine a baseline position, this is where it comes back to kind of the 3 M's of measure, manage, minimise. Without being able to, we don't yet have the systems in place to understand our baseline position of carbon emissions from our supply chain, and that's almost a critical first step for us. Once you've done that, you can then look at putting systems in place that repeat that. So you're starting to understand the impact of procurement and procurement decisions you're making, because you've got a repeatable and measurable process.
yeah, it just seems that's one of the main building blocks that we need to put in place really before we can move forward with it. You need to have a much better understanding of that, don't you? So yeah, okay, that's great, thank you.
Nick, if I may, so that carbon account inventory, is that across all contracts or the larger ones, or you make an estimate for the smaller contracts? How's that? How's that inventory is kind of assembled across all contracts?
That is to be determined. So that is a piece of work that we are only just starting on, supporting commercial services in developing. So yeah, so whether you do it just on your strategic contracts, whether you have a kind of going back to Councillor Mould's point around not making this overly bureaucratic and too hard and heavy for some of our smaller businesses, whether you have I'm speaking freely now, so I'm not providing factual evidence, but whether you have like a tiered approach to some of our more strategic contracts, would have a bit more of a stringent accounting inventory, and you have maybe a more light touch survey that goes with some of our smaller organisations. Yeah, that is work to be conducted.
Okay. Yeah, good point. Thank you. Welcome, John. John, have you got a question for us?
Yeah, Nick, I'm sorry I've come in late on this, but the usual technical problems have been resolved, I'm glad to say. You've mentioned CO2 equivalent out, renewable energy, regeneration, natural environment, and resilient communities, all very good. But how do you see climate change reduction as a social value outcome, or should we aim to achieve both? Does our social value definition need updating? It sounds a bit complicated to me, but you know, that is the question I've been asked to ask, I think, but I've taken note of what you've said earlier. So
we think that there is a direct relationship between climate change and social value, and going back to the kind of and it's an earlier point I think you weren't on the call for, John, around the kind of the principles behind the decision wheel that we've implemented, which is kind of backed by the UN sustainability goals that says that ultimately in everything that we do, there's a social floor and an environmental ceiling that we exist within, and interestingly, so the social value policy being set by government have set 5 priority areas, of which environmental protection and enhancement is one of the priority issues. So I do see the relationship. I do see there is a relationship between climate change and social value, because climate change will ultimately is going to have an impact on our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I get that, and obviously it is going to change our day-to-day life, probably more locally than worldwide to start with. But I'm just wondering, how do you think our social value definitions need updating for the council, so that the normal members like me can have an angle on this and be able to respond to our local community?
Well, I have to say, having read the literature on the government consultation on social value and the 5 priority areas, from where I'm sitting, I think they've got the right target approach. Now I'll have to say I don't know what our current social value policy says in relation to what the new government directive is.
Yeah,
I don't know how out of the line. I guess this is part of the work that's been undertaken.
I guess in the past it used to become an outcome. We deliver a service and then we get a response to that service from the public, and then we can look at that and change it accordingly. Maybe we can go down that route. I don't know. Anyway, thanks, Nick. I won't say anymore.
Super. So, members, any additional points you wish to add? We've had a really good session here with Nick. Looking ahead, any other questions you wish to ask him?
Just one question, I think, Martin, to Nick. I mean, the thing about climate change is that it is happening. There's no doubt about it. But as well as saving the planet, we've got to live on it as well. So how do we make the balance? How do you feel we make that balance so that even though we've got to be cognizant of the impact we have on our environment, how do we balance that between having normal life continue as we know it? Bit of a silly question, really.
That's the challenge of our time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Essentially, and if you follow the science and the data and the really, the clever academics that are showing, based on real evidence, the future projections for where we're heading, the status quo is not up for debate, and I know, to what degree technology is going to help maintain the everyday lives that we're used to living that's a big debating point, and I think everybody's seeing that as a saviour. But this won't be delivered just through technological advancements. There has to be some acceptance that we need to address and look at our daily lives through a sustainable lens, through how we travel, what we consume. I guess that's such a big question you're asking, John.
Yeah, I mean, I was a meteorologist and an oceanographer in my former life, so I tend to take, as you say, follow the science. But I mean, politicians shouldn't be following science; they should be making decisions based on science. But I often think, it's about time we all took responsibility for our environment that we live in, if we want to keep it safe for the future and for our children and grandchildren. Anyway, I won't get into that. Thanks very much, Nick. Very interesting.
Good. Is everyone else happy? If you are, then I'll say a big thanks to Nick. It's been a very interesting dialogue. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for answering our questions.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, very much.
If we have any blinding insights, we might come back to you and ask you for a reply in writing, if that's all right, or points of clarification at the final session. If that's okay.
Absolutely, and and I look forward to continue working with commercial services on this topic.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you for your time. Keep up the good work.
Bye.
Okay. Bye now. Right, Tracy, the wheels on the bus seem to be turning a bit better now. We seem to be getting the hang of this. How are we doing?
We've got Kath Robinson and Claire Butler on the call as well now, Chairman.
Okay. Good morning, Kath. Good morning, Claire.
Morning, Martin. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
It's a strange old world these days, isn't it?
It certainly is. Yeah, very, very odd times. Nothing seems fixed, does it?
No, and it's difficult to see when this will, if it ever goes back to the norm that we had before, really. So yeah.
And you're being supported this morning, or you brought along?
Yes. So obviously, I can talk a bit strategically at a high level, but I'm not an expert by any means into the detail of the procurement practices across the group. So Claire Butler runs our procurement section, so she's here today just in case there are sort of technical questions or more in-depth questions that I can answer.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've got Councillors Mould, Moorcroft and Keeling alongside myself here today. Councillor Lee Frost has sent his apologies, but we've got a series of questions. We will go on for about the next sort of 25 minutes or so, Kath. That's all right. Carol, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah. Hello, Kath. Nice to see you.
Hi.
Albeit virtually. Okay, so my question is, from your perspective, how do you develop local markets, including the voluntary and community social enterprise sectors?
Right, okay. So I guess we allow all sectors to bid for our tenders and do not discriminate or exclude any sort of organisation, whether that be volunteers, charity groups, SSEs, etc. So they've all got an equal opportunity to bid in for any of our work and to demonstrate their expertise and their quality. We purposely divide larger procurement tenders into smaller packages to enable and encourage SMEs to bid to do work for us. So if I give some examples, that probably helps it to be a bit more meaningful. So our signage contract, which has just gone out and been let, we split that into 4 lots rather than 1 lot. And that was on the basis to make it easier for local sign writers to participate. And probably if we didn't do that, we would have probably had 1 or 2 major national firms actually bid, whereas actually now we've got local sole traders that have bid in for that. Our plant hire, we've split that down over the last few years into operated, non-operated, small tools, larger miscellaneous plants. And that has really put up a different perspective in terms of the suppliers appointed through that. So there's 80 suppliers on that framework, and 90% of them are now based in Cornwall. And a lot of sole traders through that different approach rather than national firms. And similarly with the vehicle workshop parts, we've split that into a lot of smaller parts, and we now have small local manufacturing suppliers participating than we did before. In terms of volunteers, we are using them more. For example, at the moment we are just finalising, and is this a public session? Sorry, I
should have outlined, Kath. It's not going out live. It's recorded, and that recording will be made available to the public. If there's anything that's commercially sensitive, then we've asked officers to provide us with a written answer. So if we get into those areas.
Okay, thank you. It's just having that context in case I do step over the line. So I'll be slightly careful. So we are in the midst of doing a significant contract. That's what I'll say. I can give you the value outside with Volunteer Cornwall to help in our care division. And that will be, whilst we provide care, they will be providing the non-care element. And also an element of transport. And that has really come out of the success of some of the partnership work we've had over the COVID period. And we're now developing a significant contract with them. We also use volunteers when we can, and a range of people. So in Trafula, the care home, we've actually got a volunteer with a learning disability. So actually it really It gives them an opportunity to leave their house. They probably wouldn't have a mainstream job, but it means that we can pay them a small allowance. They feel valued. And actually, it is really good what we can get them to do, and the interaction with the more vulnerable clients down there, that works really well. In terms of the wider set of companies outside of care, in terms of volunteer groups and community groups, we have a significant network there that help us on environmental contracts, open spaces, looking after gardens, etc. And that's the equivalent of about £1 million worth of spend. That would be over 70,000 hours of volunteers. So we don't necessarily pay there. We provide materials, we pay advice, we have coordinators that they get that advice free, but it means that actually it's really good working with those communities. And we celebrate that each year with a community event. Has been at Eden in the past, but we'll have to look at something different this year, how we do it online. But we have really tried to develop local businesses. So out of our whole supplier spend, which is about 86 million, 81% of the suppliers are based in Cornwall. 58% of them are pure local, and 13% of them are maybe a firm that's based out of county, but actually has local branches here. And then we've got around 19% that are out of county. Now, this will almost certainly you can't get 100% of your suppliers local for our businesses. So if you take rock salt that we spread on the road, which is quite a significant spend, then you wouldn't be able to get that type of material in Cornwall. We have national firms for our white lining contracts because there really isn't the scale in Cornwall to keep a firm going, and with the cost of that specialist knowledge and equipment really. So there will always be, when we're purchasing material, it might be granite, well, probably not granite, but you know what I mean, the stone doesn't necessarily come from where we are. So there will always be an element of it. I think the other thing is we do work for other people. So particularly with community groups, they often have a role in choosing play equipment for, if we're doing parks and they've got grant funding, they get to choose what they buy, and often that's of national play equipment firms. And also the commissioners, the council, quite often specify products that we use. So all of the office equipment is, they want us to buy from Kinarps, which is obviously a large national firm. That's quite a lot of spend. So as well as us choosing through proper process local suppliers, there's other things that mean that actually there will always be an element, but I think we do not put anything in place that stops people being able to compete and bid for our work, whatever the groups are. I also tried to kick off with Sally Hurd. I don't know if you know her. She runs the School for Social Enterprises. So whether we could create a link there, but this was sort of a bit before COVID, and it sort of stalled, if I'm honest, with the COVID. But one of the things we were talking there is they have got quite a few sort of music therapists or workshop people, and whether we could use that in the care environment. So we do try and encourage sort of different styles of organisations to work with us.
Thank you, Kath.
Lovely. Can I just come back? So when you make your 4 lots and you're looking for sort of local, sort of maybe single people working for you, is the procurement, is it all done digitally, or are the applications done digitally? And is there a different or a simplified version for the smaller businesses as opposed to the bigger businesses when they're applying for these applying for the jobs? Do they? So what I'm trying to say is it simpler for the smaller man in the single man? Is it a simpler process for him as opposed to the bigger company? And
so I
and
might
is it
bring
done?
Claire.
And is it done digitally, or are we still on the paper route in some instances?
Okay, I'll bring Claire into that specific one in a minute, but we have done quite a lot of work with local suppliers to try and get them to understand the processes and the electronic processes, and we've had workshops and drop-in sessions, and we offer telephone support. And some of them aren't always aware, part of the portals where these things are advertised. So we have done quite a lot on direct messaging or through social media, Facebook, etc., to try and make sure that they're aware that these things are coming up, so they're not reliant on the usual portals that the bigger firms would know. And if we've got a big contract coming up, we will hold supplier events so that they are aware, and we'll try and help them with that. But in terms of is everything on electronic tendering basis, I'll ask Claire if she can just answer that one a minute, please.
Yes, hello. Yes, so we do publish all of our tenders through the electronic pro contract system, mainly because we have to be fully electronic in terms of compliance with the public contracts regulations. So we've got a legal commitment to comply with that. However, as Kath alluded to, some of our perhaps smaller sole trader, for instance, take your farmer with his tractor that wants to do work for us, who might not even have a computer. We have actually held a physical drop-in session whereby we've allowed him to visit our office, to sit at one of our computers, and we have guided them through the process of how to apply. So we're trying to be, as well as being sort of compliant with the regulations, we're also trying to be fair and not simply exclude anybody who might struggle with either technology or understanding the process. So we are trying to embed as many sort of local suppliers as we can.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you,
Martin.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Kath. Robin, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, I will. Good morning, Kath.
Okay.
Do you think our contractors have sufficient understanding of what social value is? And if not, how this might be addressed? Mike Thorne-Gibbons has touched on social value, and it appears that it is something that this group needs to look at in a bit more depth. But that was my question. Do you think our contractors have sufficient understanding of what social value is? And if not, how that might be addressed?
Right, so I think there's a vast range, really. A lot of them would think just being based in Cornwall and being an employer in Cornwall almost ticks the sort of social value box. Others have got a much broader understanding of some elements of it. But the sort of bigger national firms or the bigger firms in Cornwall are starting to obviously to get a much better understanding. We're going through a couple of processes at the moment. We're updating our social value policy for the group, which is going to go to the board probably November now. And we're looking to adopt a social value measurement tool. And obviously the new government regulations, the social value procurement model that comes in January, will give a much clearer framework. And what we would be planning to do following us adopting our policy and the government changes through our network where we support contractors, we would be planning to do some training with them. So each year we have a number of sessions with our suppliers. In the past, we've done a lot of work on health and safety with them. In the past, they have been actual physical meetings. We had one planned where we had 300 people come into Royal Cornwall showground, and we had some expert speakers coming down, HSE, and training them on different elements. What we would plan to do once those are in place is to run similar events as well, so that we try and really build that knowledge across our suppliers so that they can actually bid in successfully. I guess I'm not sure how we're going to run. We'll run them online. My worry potentially on that is whether people engage as much as they would with a physical meeting where they think, oh, I'm going there, there's a network of businesses, I'll be able to sort of maybe pick up a bit of business, where I don't feel quite that they'll feel the same about logging online to one of our events. So I think it's going to be a bit of suck it and see in the future, and see how we do that and whether people engage. I mean, we can do direct communications out, and as Claire said, we can do drop-in sessions or phone calls, but really we've got to hit a big body of people. We can't do sort of drop-in telephone calls for every single supplier. So I think that's one of the challenges in the future. We are part of the Chamber of Commerce network and organisation, and I think with those government changes, I think there's a role to play there for them, and they're doing an online business event next week, and we'll see how successful that is. But it might be that we choose to work with someone like that in the future to try and really educate people if the online training isn't a success.
Yeah,
hopefully that sort of I probably a bit and went to different avenues there, but hopefully that gives you an answer.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. And as you've explained, that does present further challenges in the future, not being able to get 300 people in a room. That's something else that requires further thought.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robin. We're going to be talking to the Chamber of Commerce a bit later on in one of our sessions, so it'd be interesting to hear, how they think it's going as well. John, have you got a question for us?
Yeah. Hi, Kath.
Hi, John.
I'm seeing you for a while.
No, I haven't. Nice
yeah,
to
I
see
think you may have answered some of these questions, but I'll ask it anyway. Before a procurement process, how do you consult or engage the market? That is, in terms of understanding how market leading providers are delivering additional value and capture that innovation as a requirement. Bit of a rambly question, but see if you can pick a few things out of that.
So how do we engage beforehand? Sorry, I had the chat box ping just as you were saying it. How we engage beforehand, and then how do we measure it?
How do you measure it? Yeah, in terms of understanding how market leading providers are delivering additional value and capture that innovation as a requirement. So how do you capture that if they're actually delivering additional value?
Right, so when we're putting a contract together, we do have, through the technical and the quality assessment criteria, we do put questions in around social value, carbon footprint, including sort of call out times, delivery, collection requirements, etc., to get a picture of that. So one example question that I've we've put is please confirm what your commitment will be as part of contract delivery in relation to any of the following and how this will be achieved. So reuse of resources, increasing recycling levels, reduce the amount of waste, use environmentally friendly goods, reduce the carbon footprint, pollution reduction, and improving fuel and energy efficiencies. So they're quite broad questions on the different social value aspects. So we have some on sort of local employment, apprenticeships and that. And then we mark those as part of the assessment process in award through the quality element of it. I think once we've got our, if just being honest, because this is sort of a developing field, once we've got the government changes and our tool for measuring, I think we can be more specific and more robust in how we measure some of that. At the moment, we've got quite broad questions and there's very differing sort of responses from different suppliers when they answer that.
Yeah, I understand that. You need more succinct responses really to any response like that.
Yeah, and I think the new regs or the new government procurement model will give us that really.
When's that coming out, Kath? Do you know?
January.
January, yeah. Okay.
That's
thanks
my
for
understanding.
that.
Lovely. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kath. Just looking to see, I had a question here. I'm just looking to see really if whether you've answered it. Yeah, so it's really how you gather evidence and measure and the delivery and impact of social value within a contract. So you have it within your contract, but actually as the contract runs along, are you going in every 12 months and seeing if those values are delivered or if that those outcomes are being progressed and within the contract? I suppose the other question I had in my mind, if you're delivering and rewriting your social value contract, is that going to be in line with Cornwall Council's procurement social value policy? So thank you, Kath.
So as a limited company, we don't always have the same policies as the council, and that's can be appropriate in some cases, and we adopt policies when they suit the business. So for foundation living wage, obviously we're adopted the policy and are working with our suppliers to get by 2022 all of them paying the foundation living wage as well. But there will be times when our policies will be different from the council, and that is because we're meant to be a commercial, agile organisation and delivering for Cornwall. In terms of the social value policy, I think probably will become more and more, all organisations will be driven to becoming more and more aligned, particularly if they're linked to public procurement because of the model being put forward by government. So I don't think ultimately they will be wildly different at all, really.
Yeah.
Does that give you?
Yeah. So the model you were talking about is the TOMS model, is that?
Yes. Yeah. That's okay. The one that we're looking to probably adopt, but that's not gone through our board yet. Okay. So I don't know if that's what the council plan to use as well.
Well,
it could be that we're aligned.
We could ask them later in this session.
Yeah. Okay.
That team coming along in a minute. Thank you.
Yeah.
Members, any other questions for Kath?
Thanks.
Claire?
Martin, sorry, can I just, because Lee did have a question here, and it was about any barriers that you might have come across, CAF, to sourcing local suppliers, and I'm just wondering, going back to the smaller suppliers that you may want, or the lone trade sole traders, does that make the process for you more difficult and more costly in going the extra mile to get them interested and get the message out there? And is it a costly thing, or is it just time, officer time?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question, really. If I do the barriers first, obviously we can't state that you have to be based in Cornwall because of the regulations. So we try to get round that by looking at like call out times, looking about other sort of quality measures, local employment, etc., that we can put into it. I think some of the barriers we've talked about in terms of the bureaucracy and scale of what they have to do, and we've tried to mitigate some of that. It's sort of horses for courses, really. One, we've got to have a resilient supplier base in Cornwall, and being able to develop relationships with subcontractors that are going to be there, that you can use on a regular basis, that you can have confidence in their quality and that close relationship. It's probably worth the additional time at the start of putting it in, and some like sole traders, it's really important that we have a workforce that includes local people that we can flex as our workloads change. So quite often we might have a plan from the council on how much work they're going to give Cormac of a year, but we never plan to deliver that all internally, because quite often it will change in the year. Quite often there's slippage in that, and so we use like the subcontractors to, when we've got peaks and when we've got drop-offs, that we can flex, so we're not carrying a huge overhead. So it is really critical to the business that we have got a whole range of people that we can use, that know us, know our working practices, know our risk assessments on site, that have almost know the teams they're working with. So yeah, it is a cost at the start, but probably when it's working really well, it actually, that cost doesn't sort of matter, because you get it far better. But how you sort of quantify that and cost and reward, we don't do that. We just know that it's a gut feeling that it's worth it.
Yeah, you got a good base in the end, and it's as you say, it swings and roundabouts probably at the end of the day. Yeah. Lovely, thank you.
Okay,
thank you, Kath. Thank you, Carol. Members, I see you've got an X in the box there, Robin. I think we are due to finish this session 4 minutes ago. We did agree at the start, I think, if we had supplementary questions, perhaps we could write to Kath and you could supply us answers that way, if that's all right, Kath.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
I mean, I can stay as long as you need, but obviously you've probably got a vast list of people coming in.
We have Mark Pierce waiting for us to talk us through some of the legal constraints of what we can and cannot do.
Fun.
And I did make it clear to members that we could ask those, if we could have written answers to further questions, or maybe even if we've got some critical questions, ask people to come back and answer them in our 5th and final session, where we've synthesized some thoughts and some ideas and are just testing the reality and the practicality of delivering that. So thank you and Claire for your time today. It's been a good catching up and good hearing what Cormac and the group of companies are up to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good luck with your inquiry.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye now. Members, there's a question there around supplementary questions. I'm in this session. I'm only allowing questions from the inquiry members themselves. At the end of the session, when we've ceased recording, we can broaden our audience and bring in questions and reflections from the wider participants here. Tracy, how are we doing? Is Mark around?
He's not, because
have a break.
You plan to have a break between 11:25 and 11:35. Oh, Mark's put a message to say he's just dialed in.
Okay. Well, shall we have a break, members? Do you wish to have a break? We're due to work between now and 1 o'clock. I think another coffee might be for 5 minutes.
A 5-minute cup of coffee would be lovely.
Okay.
I think 2 cups of coffee would be good.
All right. Okay, members, we'll have a 5-minute break and assemble back at 11:36. Thank you for joining us, Mark. We'll be with you very, very shortly.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Morning. So are we all back? Carol, Robin, John?
I'm just eating a biscuit and I'll be right there.
Yeah, all here.
John, are you with us?
I certainly am.
Well done.
Took me long enough to get back. You want me to start?
Mark, are you ready?
I'm pure.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
We've got a session now that's due to last sort of roughly till midday. We've got four of the 5 members here. We've got apologies from Councillor Lee Frost, but we're joined by Councillor Mould, Councillor Rob Moorcroft, and Councillor Keeling. So, welcome, John. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Good morning, Mark. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Nice to see you.
You can hear me okay, can you?
I can hear you clearly, thank you.
Okay, well, the first question is, from your perspective, are there any legal implications in relation to developing local markets, including the voluntary and community sector and social enterprise sectors as well?
Yes, is the very short sort of answer. But I'll go on to explain sort of why. There are certainly legal implications in terms of market development. There's an expectation and a requirement on the council, indeed, in terms of market development in certain sectors. So one example of that is the Care Act, where there are positive obligations on the council to ensure that it develops effective markets around that, where there's sort of markets of failure or market issues. If we are looking to develop the market, so what we need to be clear on is sort of how we're doing it at what point. So the critical point for any kind of market shaping sort of activity is to consider that sort of before you kind of commence the procurement process, because once you're in a live procurement process, the opportunities for market tend to be more limited because you're in a sort of regulated and constrained process. So I promise I'm going to use the B word once this morning. So sort of Brexit. But the policy and regulatory context is still the fact that sort of the public contracts regulations have been sort of imposed into UK law. We're still subject to those. So where we're in a regulated procurement process where we are subject to the public contracts regs, and of course that applies to certain contracts above certain thresholds, then sort of we are required to sort of comply with sort of obligations around sort of equal treatment, non-discrimination, transparency, etc., which can impose constraints in terms of what you can do. But certainly there's an absolute expectation that we should be doing things sort of before we go to a live procurement process to consider how we kind of stimulate the market, how we get the best opportunity and best outcome. Because if we're not doing that, then arguably we're actually doing ourselves and the public and suppliers a disservice because we're not actually getting the best out of opportunities. And I know I'm well aware of the fact that sort of commercial services colleagues are on the call, and sort of I think Rachel's in the session that's sort of after me, and I'm well aware of the fact that we do undertake sort of market sort of engagement activities on significant procurements. So and that's beneficial because if we do that, it means we're more likely to get a better outcome, a better response, sort of and be clearer in terms of what we can gain from a particular commission. So if I can give you an example of something where sort of if we don't follow the regs, if we don't follow the public contracts regs during a procurement process, then a couple of consequences could apply. So firstly, so we face the risk of legal challenge. So if we don't comply with the public contracts regs when we should, then we have the possibility of getting to a process that is overturned and declared ineffective. We face the possibility of fines and damages. We also sort of, perhaps even more importantly, even if we're not challenged, face the prospect of not actually delivering what we set out to deliver. So sort of, and that's a more real risk, I would say, in many cases. We don't see many procurement challenges. They're not unheard of, but they are sort of, they do happen, but sort of, it's more the fact that we've probably failed to achieve sort of the right level of value for money. But certainly sort of, there's nothing preventing us from sort of undertaking work pre-procurement to actually work out sort of what does the market look like? What are the barriers there to sort of activity? Sort of, and what things can we do to help stimulate and support that through other means and other measures? So sort of certainly from my perspective, sort of you're more likely to achieve a successful outcome if you've kind of looked at that sort of process pre-starting a live procurement. So it's almost a sort of preliminary stage essentially in terms of thinking, well, how are we going to kind of what are we really looking for here, and sort of how are we going to achieve that? So and to do that effectively, sort of the market needs to understand sort of what the what the authorities' current circumstances are, so what the likely scope of those services are going to be, and indeed sort of what sort of things that the authority is going to be looking for out of this procurement. So and I know that I won't stray too far into this yet, but sort of social value, if we have a legal obligation to consider social value in our procurement activity. If we are not clear on that, if we're not transparent about what we are looking to achieve, then we won't get that value. And secondly, we could be in a situation where we have a flawed process and we have evaluation criteria that are not truly reflective of the subject matter of the contract. So it's important that sort of we do that sort of market shaping, that thought beforehand, before we actually go live with a full procurement process. So particularly for sort of the larger, more strategic procurements and those that are subject to the regs. So, and of course the regulations sort of don't apply to all of our activity. There'll be sub-threshold sort of procurements and also certain contracts that sort of will be outside the scope of the regulations. But the actual value for services contracts, sort of where they are fully regulated, is actually relatively low if we consider the total contract cost. It's just over 180,000. So it's not very high value before you start hitting quite significant sort of process implications.
Yeah, thanks for that. It sounds a very prescriptive process, but also a very necessary one as well. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, I think sort of I would say that there isn't a prescriptive process in terms of how you engage with the market pre-procurement. I think you have more freedom in terms of that, but it's important that you do that pre-procurement. If you're in a live procurement process, sort of, I think that so that's where sort of you've almost sort of missed the opportunity there, if you like. And although you do have, I mean, sort of, for more complex procurements, you have opportunities, for example, to kind of undertaking a sort of a more nuanced sort of negotiated process. So there are a number of procurement processes, for example, competitive dialogue, competitive procedure with negotiation, sort of innovation partnership, which allow for a bit more cross dialogue with bidders. But again, I would say even with those processes, sort of if you haven't considered sort of the position more globally at the outset, you're not going to be that clear in terms of what your parameters are going to be. And B, sort of those are quite kind of potentially quite expensive and can be quite long-winded processes. So again, I would be saying, what have we done? What activity have we undertaken to actually understand what we're commissioning and how that works, and sort of, and I think we do that. I think sort of we don't always get it right, but certainly sort of part of the kind of gateway processes that the council uses are meant to sort of capture some of that. So when we look at sort of lessons learned, sort of benefits realised in terms of existing contracts, that's really important in terms of understanding, well, so what went right when we did something previously, what went wrong, but also then using that to help inform some of the questions in terms of how we improve things. And there's always room for improvement. We'll never be in sort of a perfect place. So, but we need to consider how we then bring that in and improve the outcomes. And that's more important than ever, considering sort of, you know, I've been in local government now since 2004. And I'm old enough to remember sort of, some of you might remember Gershon efficiencies. I think it was 2.5–3%. Sort of, I look back at those days with sort of wonder and awe in terms of, well, compared to what we have to do now. But it's not just about money. It's about the actual outcomes for sort of our kind of sort of for the public as well.
Yeah.
And if we get that wrong, then sort of, you know, that can be really quite painful. So it's not. So I think legal challenges are more remote risk. It's more likely that you face other challenges which may be more significant.
Yeah, I guess you do. I've been around since 2003, and I remember the Gershon efficiencies as well. Oh, they're still around.
I think they've been sort of superseded. I think.
I've run out of money since then, John. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, John. Carol, would you like to be both yourself and Lee Frost in this inquiry? Thank you.
Well, hello, Mark. Thank you. I'll try and merge them both together because it was around following on from the first question. I mean, how mindful do we need to be from a legal perspective when we are engaging with the market before a tender process? And also, do you see any legal implications to applying a social value policy and also embedding weightings into the evaluation criteria?
Thank you, Sir Carol. I think we do need to be mindful in engaging the market in terms of ensuring that sort of we are so fair and transparent in that process. So if we're doing market engagement pre-procurement, I would expect us to be kind of advertising that sort of appropriately, so we get sort of appropriate representative response. And of course, so the response is information, so it's feedback, it's consultation. It's not sort of saying that is then blindly followed and kind of imported into what we do. So we need to listen, we need to understand. But that doesn't take away sort of the decision making from the authority in terms of how we kind of do things. So the feedback, we need to listen to it, we need to look at it, but sort of we still have that responsibility to think, well, actually, so if we've taken this into account and this is what we're going to do. It is sort of social value is actually a legal obligation on us. It's been a legal obligation for quite some time, so it's not a new thing. But I would say increasingly important in terms of how we kind of do business and how we undertake things. We have to be careful sort of here in terms of ensuring that we don't fall into a trap of kind of saying that sort of we're going to have absolutely one size fits all for every single thing that we do. So because sort of one of the concepts of European law that's kind of sort of brought into sort of English law or British law indeed as a result of the sort of regulations is sort of the consideration of proportionality, and that's written through sort of both the directive and sort of actually the public contracts regs in terms of ensuring that what we do is proportionate, linked to the subject matter of the contract. So you absolutely can and are expected to include and consider social value sort of considerations when you are undertaking your procurement activity. And there's been sort of development in terms of case law and also the drafting the regulations. So because the current sort of regulations based on the current directive are an evolution from where we were previously. So Social Value Act came in 2012, public contracts regs sort of current sort of 2015 with amendments. So but we are required to consider that, but it should be proportionate and it should be linked to the subject matter of the contract. So if you can and should consider how you deal with things like sort of climate change, how you deal with social implications, employment practices, etc. But the trick is ensuring that you do that in a way that actually complies with your obligations in terms of the procurement regs, complies with your fiduciary obligations, but also means that you actually get an effective outcome. So what you want is something that is sort of going to be actually work in practice. So and it can be quite difficult to achieve. It's not impossible to do, but what we need to be kind of careful on is sort of that we are clear on what we're asking for. Sort of in the first place, what we're asking for is linked to the subject matter of the contract. So I would say that you'd consider, for example, the duration of a contract might be a relevant consideration. The value of the contract might be a relevant consideration in terms of the types of things that you might ask for. Because if you've got a very sort of high value but very short term contract, you might not expect the same sort of kind of considerations, perhaps, sort of in terms of say apprenticeships, as you would do if you were looking at a longer term arrangement. So sort of and it can be tricky sort of if you don't get it right, because again sort of not to be Mr. Doom and Gloom, but sort of it depends on the sector and the market sort of, but there are certain sectors certainly where you're more likely to see a legal challenge if you don't do things right. But again, even more importantly than that, I would say, is if you don't do it right, actually you're not going to achieve what you want in the first place. You may be sort of you may end up in a situation where you distort the market. You end up not paying what you should be paying, but you don't achieve the outcome as well. So it's really important that it's thought through as to how we do this. So I don't think anybody would say that the social value is sort of superfluous, or it's just an added extra, we shouldn't have it. I think it's critical. I think it's absolutely fundamental, and we do have that legal obligation, but it's how we do that and ensuring that we capture that in the right way, so we don't end up in a position where we don't achieve what we want and end up back to square one potentially.
So if I'm understanding this, so if we had the basic set of outcomes that we needed to achieve, but through the sizes of the company we had a graded approach, we set the same criteria to every application, but maybe the needs were not quite so complicated, or for a smaller company, is that still going to work? Because the bottom line of this is the bureaucracy of all of this.
Yeah.
Is a smaller company going to find the bureaucracy of filling out all of this just too onerous? So
well, I think my response to that would be, you've got to be really careful. If you're putting an opportunity out, one of the things that you need to consider is and one of the things that I would say is part of your market engagement is it right sized? Have we scoped this correctly? So sort of because you have things like sort of, have we lotted this sort of appropriately? Sort of how is that going to impact on sort of the market? How does the market work in this sector? So is it the right size? Is it the right shape for this particular market in terms of what the opportunity is? We should always be really, really careful and conscious of and this is why I kind of refer to the transparency point. So what we can't do and what we mustn't do really is fall into the trap of saying, well, we've got a procurement opportunity, but if you are an entity that's sort of this size, you don't have to fill in, you don't have to comply with these kind of these obligations. So because I think sort of in that instance, you're falling into a trap of kind of effectively saying, well, we're going to distort competition by saying that sort of Joe Blogs and Co. is going to be more favoured in this process than sort of Fred Blogs and Co. So, for example, but I think there are ways to do that, and I think the things that we need to be looking at and always kind of having a weather eye on is sort of what our barriers are, and are we being proportionate, for example, in terms of what our kind of selection stage kind of looks like. So, do you understand what I mean when I talk about selection stage? Because of course, in public procurement, you have selection, which is whether somebody's capable of undertaking a particular contract, and then you have award, which is around what they actually bring to the table, so what the offer looks like in terms of how they're going to carry out the contract. Now, again, the public contracts regs sort of make it very clear that sort of there are certain things that are mandatory in terms of what we do. So for example, sort of in relation to criminal activity or sort of fraud and corruption, that sort of thing. But actually, some of the other criteria do depend upon sort of the kind of value or kind of the proportionality around the contract. So what we need to be careful of is that we don't impose sort of selection kind of criteria that act as a too high a bar, so because that sort of again sort of potentially would mean that sort of we're not complying with our obligations under the regs, but also even if we didn't see a challenge, that we're artificially narrowing competition and lowering who can do things. But I think it does depend. It does depend on the sort of on the contract as to what you ask for to some extent. So sort of, you know, one example, we've got a very large kind of waste collection contract that sort of clearly sort of in order to actually fulfill that requirement, we would need sort of a kind of entity or group of entities that come together that kind of meet minimum thresholds, and that might be very different to say a contract for delivery of kind of children's services in a particular area. So again, I think sort of it's been proportionate. It's considering sort of rather than saying we've got this that fits everything. It's kind of that there may be things that you say, well, actually we've got to adjust that slightly. So if you're in terms of what we do, because if we're not, again, we won't be achieving the right sort of outcomes.
No, brilliant. Okay, that's really comprehensive. Thank you.
That's right. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Mark. Robin, have you got a question?
Yes, a very short one, Mark.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, you all right? What are the legal barriers, if any, to awarding more contracts locally?
Well, I think so. I'm going to sound like a politician now. I'm going to probably turn the question on its head a little bit. We've just talked about sort of legal barriers in terms of kind of how we kind of allow access to procurement opportunities, how we kind of consult with the market, how we kind of shape the market, and how we consider things like social value. I think the barriers to sort of awarding things locally, so what you can't do for good or ill is to say that sort of actually we're going to restrict something to a purely local kind of market. So where your procurement is a regulated to procurement, so where we, for example, within the ambit of the public contracts regulations, what we can't do there is to say that sort of you have to have a local supplier. You have to be a local supplier in order to bid for this, because that would be sort of a breach of our kind of obligations in terms of allowing kind of access to public contracts. But I would kind of turn it on its head, and I would be saying, so I'd be thinking along the lines of, well, so actually, sort of what kind of things can we do to support the local supply chain? And I know, and I'm very well aware that sort of colleagues in commercial services do quite a lot of work with our supply chain. I think I would be very wary about putting sort of a metric that's for example, said something like sort of, well, you know, what proportion of invoices are from kind of companies undertaking activity in Cornwall, because of course, sort of what could happen there is that sort of you could quite foreseeably have, for example, an entity that sort of is a large national or multinational company that simply opens a very small office in Cornwall for invoicing purposes. So I think so it's more about how we ensure that sort of where we have opportunities, that sort of there's enough time and enough for the market to respond, that the barriers that we put in terms of what we're asking for are proportionate to the the thing that we're buying, the goods, works or services that we're buying, that we've carried out that sort of pre-procurement sort of stimulation activity, and we've carried out sort of things where we've helped sort of suppliers understand where we're coming from, what our needs are, etc. And that sort of we and this might sound odd coming from a lawyer, but sort of we keep the process as simple as we reasonably can. So I think sometimes that sort of, you know, there can be a danger of complicating something that's already complicated. So sort of, you know, what we want to do is kind of get sort of a level of understanding and response, because of course, sort of, you know, you will find sort of, especially for some of the larger sort of entities that we deal with, that they just have bid writing teams and they're able to deal with kind of a level, put together a very good package. But actually what we should be thinking about is, well, how accessible is this? Because quite often, although we're buying something, we're selling something as well. We're selling an opportunity, essentially. We're basically saying to people, sort of, this is something that we want, that Cornwall wants to deliver. So we always have to be thinking about who is the underlying sort of client for this, who's the underlying customer for this sort of activity. We need to be thinking about sort of, you know, what sort of things are we asking for, and are we clear enough in terms of what we're asking for in approaching the market, and sort of, you know, not forgetting, of course, that sort of actually we may be contracting sort of, and a construction contract's probably a good example of this. So quite often with the larger construction contracts, sort of, in essence, it's almost like a management contracting type activity. So we contract with a prime contractor for a construction project, but actually there are lots and lots of suppliers underneath that. So it's ensuring that those suppliers are treated fairly in terms of things like sort of payments as well. So and we do that. We do things like sort of we put sort of provisions that are proportionate, but also protect us in terms of ensuring that subcontractors are paid within a sort of reasonable period, for example. Because if we don't do that, sort of, then that sort of can put unnecessary pressure on supply chains and also be a risk to us. Because if supply chains on a construction job start to fall over, then that becomes a risk to the employer as much as anything else in terms of failing to achieve outcomes, really. So what we can't do is say expressly, you've got to be Cornish or be within Cornwall in order to sort of actually participate in this activity. But I would be saying that there are other things that we can and do to ensure that sort of that there is access to sort of work. And there may also, to be fair, be sort of things where actually our local market isn't in the best place, and it's going to take time to actually build that up, and actually, or where the particular sort of thing that we're asking for is quite niche and specialized, and we need expertise that isn't currently within Cornwall. So I would say that there may well be circumstances where actually kind of, you know, we end up with someone from further afield, but that's okay because it's relating to that. What we should be always considering is sort of what's the, you know, who does this best, and that's not always going to be who does it cheapest. It's going to be who comes forward with that sort of most economically advantageous sort of proposal meets that criteria. So that's why it's really, really important that we think about what quality looks like, sort of for a particular activity, how we achieve things like social value, and how we're valuing kind of the commercial aspect as well.
Okay, Mark, thank you.
I'm conscious of time, members, and I could carry on listening to you all afternoon, Mark. Thank you. It's been
right.
Absolutely fascinating to see it from a legal perspective like that. They've been very interesting answers. Thank you.
No problem. I would always see legal as not necessarily saying to you what you can't do, although we may say that occasionally, absolutely, but it's more how you achieve that. So we might have a different view in terms, we might have a slightly different view in terms of how we achieve an outcome. But the outcome ambition will be shared normally.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thank you for your time.
That's right.
We have to move on, unfortunately.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I wonder if thank you, Mark. If Rachel is with us.
I am, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, Rachel. Sorry, I'm just full of admiration for chairman of these meetings. Coming in on WhatsApp, my phone's ringing, the landline's ringing, my watch is ringing, and I'm full of admiration for chairman. But sorry, we are a little bit late. It's entirely my fault. But we've got a series of questions for you. Councillor Lee Frost is not here with us. He sends his apologies, as does Councillor Peter Le Broy, incidentally. But if you're ready, we'll kick off then. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Do you want to lead us off then, Robin?
Yes, I will. Good morning, Rachel, or good afternoon now.
Good afternoon, Robin. Good afternoon.
You've mentioned previously in presentations that we've had, there is a national framework called the Social Value TOMS, the Themes, Outcomes and Measures, that can be used to quantify social value in pounds and pence. Are you planning to use this? And if so, how will you ensure that we use the right measures for Cornwall Council and also measure the value accurately?
Yeah, okay. I think previously we talked about the fact that we are in the process of reviewing our responsible procurement policy. We currently have a social value policy in place. I think it was signed off in 2018. I think things have moved on significantly since that point, and I think it's an opportunity now to kind of review where we go next. So as part of the development of the policy, and we are in the development phase at the moment, we're looking at a number of different things. So we've been exploring what other authorities have been doing. Manchester's a good example, Preston's a good example. Some of those other authorities seem to be further ahead. But the other thing that we've been looking at is the social value portal, and the National TOMS framework, which stands for Themes, Outcomes and Measures. And I think the thing that's significant really for me around the TOMS framework and the social value portal is it's something that has been developed in partnership between the LGA, National TOMS and around 40 other different organisations. So I think my starting point would be, why wouldn't we start there in terms of the development of our policy? I think the thing I've been really impressed by actually in relation to the National TOMS is that one, I think it really nicely aligns to the council's business plan priorities. Two, that actually for me it enables us to quantify in quite a scientific way actually how do we derive a financial value to social value. So how do we get hold of it and how do we measure it? And that becomes very important in terms of being able to evaluate different bids through a procurement process. It also becomes really important when you're you've awarded the contract and you're trying then to be able to measure the impact of that value over the lifetime time of the contract. So I am attracted to the national TOMS model. I think it's good. I think it gives us a proxy. I think it enables us also to start to get intelligence from across the country around different sectors. I think it gives us also benchmarking intelligence. And so I'm interested in potentially looking at using that tool as a tool that's embedded as part of the measurability effectively of our emerging policy. The other thing, and I think Mark touched on this, is that central governments have been working on a new social value policy as well. And they launched that. It's called PPN 0620, which effectively is a policy position statement coming out of government. And they are launching that. That will go live in January. And interestingly, and I've been listening to the conversation actually kind of quite closely, what they've done is they've identified that it will be a mandatory requirement, which has moved effectively the policy position on. So it's a mandatory requirement now for government departments. So they are not imposing that yet on local authorities, but for government departments over effectively OJU in terms of those higher level thresholds to be applying a minimum requirement of 10%. And I think what's significant, obviously, is that what government have done is they've identified that kind of 10% threshold as part of any OJU procurement within central government is a minimum requirement to start to differentiate the difference around effectively the impact that social value will have. So that's another thing that we're looking at as part of the evolution effectively of our policy, is kind of where government have gone on this, because I think PPN 0620 is neat, it's simple. I think we need to think about actually, if government has started at 10%, where do we kind of position ourselves in terms of our weighting percentage? But they have gone much further in terms of, as I say, making this an explicit mandatory requirement, whereas before it's been advisory, and that will come into force in January. And I'm sure that if Sarah were able to kind of back me up on this, what Sarah would say is that essentially these policies normally start with kind of central government procurements and are likely to find their way out into local government procurements. So I think that's interesting.
Lovely, thank you very much. And I've got to say, a very impressive background. I like that.
Thank you very much.
So I think you might well have answered a lot of what I was going to ask there, because I think during the technical briefing you said your current procurement process allows a range of social values to be implemented, and my question really was how do we become more conscious in that? And my final point was really, are social value outcomes mandatory or core? But I think you said we're on a journey where they might become mandatory. So it's really around how can we be more ambitious for social values going forward?
Yeah, so the current policy that was signed off in 2018 by full council talked about it being a mandatory requirement to consider social value, and it set effectively a range between 3% and I think
Is it breaking up for anyone else?
Yeah. Sorry, I think I just got knocked out. Can people hear me?
Yeah, you're back with us. Thank you.
Okay. I was talking about the current social value policy, the one that was signed off by full council in 2018, having a range of between 3 and 15%. And I think the challenge that we've got around our current policy is hand on heart. So I think I've spoken to you before about the scale of the number of procurements that are going out the door, the scale of the contracts that we manage. You know, we're spending around £800 million a year on our third party supply chain. It's how do we take the aggregation of that in a much simpler way and say, actually, across that £800 million that we're spending on our supply chain, this is a quantifiable articulation of the social value that we're getting effectively through those contracts and those different suppliers. And that's the bit at the moment that we haven't been able to crack with our current policy, that I'm really, really keen to make sure that this new policy, and again, this is why for me, the national TOMs are attractive, is it gives me an ability to be able to measure that. And I was interested in kind of some of the discussions about what social value is. And, you know, Mark articulated that social value has been around legally since 2012. And for me, very simply, it's about the additionality that we get through our procurements. So if the primary purpose of a procurement might be to buy a new IT system, the question then for me is, what's the social value that we get above and beyond the primary purpose of that procurement? And that social value has got to focus on three broad areas. It's got to focus on social value, it's got to focus on economic value, and it's got to focus on environmental value. And one of the things that I want to make sure that our new policy does is it brings together those three components into one place, because at the moment we've got
Gone again.
I'm sorry. I really apologise. I've not been having problems with my IT for a long time. I'm going to take the camera off, and then hopefully I won't then have the problem around being locked out. So apologies. Bear with me a minute. Okay. Hopefully the network will no longer be bad. You won't be able to see me, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me, which I think probably is far more important. So one of the things that we're wanting to do effectively is to bring those different threads of the social value policy into one place and to clearly articulate how we are going to measure this, not just at individual procurement level, but as an aggregation, so we can answer that question about actually what social value are we getting across effectively the whole of the supply chain, because at the moment we can't answer that. Does that Councillor Eddie, does that answer your question?
Well, only partially, because you disappeared again, I'm afraid. We missed the final concluding sentence, I think. Sorry.
So in terms of pulling together these policies into a single place and using TOMs and using the TOMs framework as a way of measuring effectively the aggregated value of social value across all of our supply chain is where we want to go.
Okay. Yeah, we got that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Apologies around the network.
No, it's not. It's not your fault. It's one of those things. Carol, do you want to lead us on?
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. My question's around, you sort of touched on it, I think. It's how we set the social value targets, and then how do we measure that progress against them as part of contract management moving forward?
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So this is where we need to make a decision as part of the policy around which KPIs we want to be using if we do as part of effectively the implementation of the TOMs work, because I think that there are, and this is one of the challenges around TOMs, is it's very good, but there are, I think, over 140 odd KPIs. And that's incredibly complicated. And what we end up then doing is almost diluting the impact, because we're focusing on such a broad range of KPIs as an organisation. So I think we as an organisation have got to choose the KPIs that are most important to us in Cornwall, And then we will need to choose those KPIs as part of any effectively procurement. And then we need to have mechanisms in place around being able to monitor the performance of that through our contract management process. So I think almost the more complicated piece is not so much about how do we practically go around embedding that into a procurement and then through our contract management methodology. It's almost as an organisation through the policy development, distilling down which of those TOMs are most important to us, and how do we make sure that when we are going through a procurement process that we are able to effectively measure and assess in a very transparent way what that supplier is saying it's able to deliver in respect to the delivery of that TOMs, and then managing that over the lifetime of effectively the contract through our contract management mechanisms.
Brilliant. Yes, now I've got it.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. So I'll stand in for Liam. Sorry, John. My apologies.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do Lee first, that's fine. But I'll.
No, press on. Sorry, it was my mistake.
Okay. Well, I mean, hello, Rachel. Good
Hiya,
morning.
John.
And good afternoon, should I say?
Afternoon.
You may have covered this indirectly, but I'll ask the question anyway. You mentioned previously that the council's procurement system is not considered to offer a good customer experience. Where are we currently in terms of replacing or upgrading it? And what are the expected timescales? I don't think you gave us the timescales, but you did mention something like this earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the moment, the council's got a system called Proactis, and the challenge that we've got around our current system, as you've rightly identified, John, is it's not very user-friendly, and we've had kind of lots of feedback to that effect from our supply chain. Some of the other challenges that we've got, which are equally as important, are that at the moment we have an e-procurement system, but we don't have an e-contract management supplier relationship management system. So in terms of the whole sourcing cycle, actually we want to be able to have a system that is able to talk to each other a bit more around the sourcing element, the bit where we're going out and we're buying, and then the ongoing contract management, supplier relationship management elements. So that's something that we wanted to address as part of the new system, as well as it being user friendly. And then the other bit, which ties into the work that Tracy Langley has been doing around the outcomes-based budgeting, is that at the moment we have a system that holds all of our contracts electronically in one place, but we have a different system, e-system, that's dealing with effectively the payment of our suppliers. So when we're trying to move into, as an organisation, a position where we're understanding much more clearly our spend by category, which is the work that Tracy's been doing or we've been supporting with around outcomes-based budgeting, it's much more difficult to do that when I'm not able at the moment to pull off spend information alongside effectively our contract management information. So one of the things, John, that we're wanting this new system to be able to do is to be able to interface across with Oracle, to be able to generate effectively spend information aligned to our contract information, which at the moment we can't do, that makes things like category management, which is a kind of very common methodology that's absolutely kind of international best practice about understanding our different spend categories. It gives us the ability to be able to do that. So we went through last year a process of identifying effectively what our requirements were, and we've purchased effectively what's called source to contract, which is a well-known effectively public sector system that addresses some of the issues that we've had around the historic system. Now, what we're doing at the moment is we've got a project effectively within the commercial team that's about implementing that system, because as you can imagine, and I'm sure you've heard through some of the feedback around Oracle, it's quite complicated and there's lots of things that we need to consider. But we're expecting having that new system in its first phase operational by the 1st of April next year. And then we will be rolling out the second stages of the implementation beyond that point. And there's a detailed, which we're quite happy to provide if you'd like. There's a detailed project plan around the implementation of that new system. One of the other things that's just probably worth pointing out is one of the conversations that we're having with the source to contract provider is that they have embedded in some of their systems the TOMS software, so the social value portal stuff that enables us then to embed that as part of our e-procurement system.
That sounds pretty good. Could you supply the details?
Absolute sense that if we purchase source to contract, we also want to be able to use the TOMS technology as well for social value.
Well, that sounds fine. We haven't lost you again, have we?
I hope not. Did you hear that, John, or did I?
Yeah, I did. What would be useful if if those timescales you're talking about, particularly to do with Oracle, could be forwarded on to Tracy and be embedded as part of the report. That would be very useful indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, of course, no problem.
Thank you very much for that, Rachel. It gives you a lot of confidence in the system. Thank you.
Members, I'm mindful of time. I'm going to skip over Lee's question for a minute. And Rachel, if I may, what value of contract would you seek to add social value? And should this be lower or higher or across all contracts?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. I mean, I think as a starting point, we absolutely should be looking at making it mandatory for our procurements which are over overdue. That's the approach that's been adopted by government, and thinking about the delivery of value and where we want to spend our time delivering value adding activity. I think it's absolutely got to be in those procurements which are over overdue, which actually, to be perfectly honest, over the lifetime of the contract is not very high. It's about 180,000. I think it's 187,000 pounds for services contract. For capital, I think it's 4.7 million. So that's not very high, and I think the challenge in terms of our procurement activity is that for lower value purchasing, that increasingly what we want to be doing is doing that through framework contracts. We want to be doing it through DPSs. And what will be important then is for that lower value activity, that if we've got different compliant routes to market, that we're making sure that as part of setting those compliant routes across a bigger aggregation, that actually we're building social value in at that point. So, for example, if we establish a new DPS, which is a dynamic purchasing system, I don't know, for the provision of home care, that we build into that DPS award social value at that point rather than at the individual purchasing level. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So we wouldn't have the scenario where a contract is broken down into bits that are less than the overdue and then not have a requirement for social value to be added.
So I mean, obviously we haven't finalised the policy yet. I think my view would be, and I think it needs to be tested, is that we spend our time in the areas where we're able to add the most value. We don't make this overly complicated, and I think Mark's talked to you about the principles that run through our procurement activity. We absolutely make it a mandatory requirement, which is what government have done for procurements that are over overdue. And then for the purchasing that's below it, we make sure that where we're establishing the compliant routes, we absolutely build in social value. But I don't know whether we would want to necessarily make the activity below on its own. We would want to spend a lot of time embedding social value at that point. But I think that needs to be tested.
Okay. So something to think about there. Thank you.
Something to think about. Something to think about.
For certainly this inquiry to think about as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Robin, have you got a question?
Yes, thank you, Martin. Of Cornwall Council's top 10 suppliers by value that were listed in the budget presentation at last week's CAS meeting, 8 or possibly 9 of them have head offices outside of Cornwall, and all have smaller sub-offices within the county. As we have been told, if invoices submitted have a Cornwall postcode, they are counted in the figures as local suppliers. Could you give us some detail on the social value they'll bring into the county, please?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think this is at the heart of, I think, the point that Mark raised, that at the moment, one of our corporate indicators is around almost, are they a Cornish supplier being a proxy for social value? And of course, the methodology around the measurement of whether they're a Cornish supplier is, and the only way, in fairness, that probably we would be able to do that is where do they send their invoices from? And I think what is essential that, and I'm hoping that this process will find a way through, is what do we want? What do we want in terms of those top 10 suppliers, or however many suppliers we've got? Do we want them to be delivering in terms of additional social value for Cornwall? And that might be different, Robin, across different contracts. So it might be, for example, that where we're spending lots of money on big IT contracts and those providers are outside of Cornwall, it might be that what we want to be stipulating is a different social value indicator from the TOMs to a construction provider that's based in Cornwall that will be appointing and recruiting lots of people who live in Cornwall. So they will be different depending on the different type of contract that they will be delivering in terms of their social value proposition. In terms of the specific question of what social value do those top 10 suppliers bring to Cornwall, I'd really like to be in a position where at a click of a button, I'm able to answer that question. But I can't do that at the moment because, as I said before, we don't have a way of being able to capture, because we haven't got a model like Tom's, what that value is. What I would have to do in order to be able to answer that question is to go back to the individual contract managers and say, can you pull me out the social value KPIs for those different contracts which will be different for those different contracts, and tell me how they're performing. And of course, when you have 5,500 suppliers, many, many more contracts, £800 million worth of third party spend, we've got to be in a position where we're able to at a click of a button say, actually, this is the social value that we think effectively those contractors would be providing. And that's, for me, what Tom's will do, is to be able to give me much greater sophistication around being able to measure that.
Lovely, thank you. I suppose it goes back to the point of looking at a local supplier in the county, what they can actually provide, and some of these probably are specific to outside of the county. That's why we can't go more local.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I was looking at we've just now, as of October, we've now got our balanced scorecard in place around effectively the commercial indicators that we agreed that Councillor Ethel Gibbons alluded to in his opening comments. So this is the first time we've got the data cut, and it will be probably of no surprise to you that CAS as a directorate has got the lowest number of organisations that have got offices and invoices being sent from Cornwall. And of course, that is reflective of the nature of the types of services that CAS provide. There will be HR-based services, there will be IT-based services. And then when you compare that to something like adult social care, where actually there's a much higher proportion of local suppliers who have an office in Cornwall, I think it's kind of no surprise really, based on the profile of the types of services that are provided effectively by those different directorates.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Well, we lost her again.
No, sorry, Robin. I am here. I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Robin. Members, any other issues, any other questions for Rachel while we have her here? Okay, if you're content, then we will move on. I just in the formal session, I'd like to thank those officers who've given us their time, their thoughts, their information, and I'm always very impressed by the skill and the knowledge that they have laid before us here today. So I do thank you all for your time and for your efforts. Our next session, as I outlined earlier, will be on Thursday, the 12th of November, when we're talking to the Voluntary Sector Forum, Chamber of Commerce, Southwest Procurement Board, Neil at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, and the Cornwall Federation of Small Businesses. So hopefully we'll see you back here then, and I think we're going to close this session now. So thank you all. Members, don't go away because we've